The Young and the Restless spoilers Friday's full episodes November 14, 2025. Under the dim glow of the jazz club's amber lights, Billy Abbott felt the weight of every choice he had ever made pressing down on him, yet for the first time in a long while, there was something almost human in the way the night unfolded. He had arrived with the intention of distracting himself, but as fate would have it, Sally Spectra was there, waiting with the same restless energy that had always surrounded her. There was no pretense in her smile tonight, no calculated charm, just exhaustion wrapped in confidence. The city outside hummed with quiet gossip, and inside, it felt as though every conversation carried the ghost of secrets no one dared to say aloud. Sally, still stung by her recent failures, admitted that she had tried to brush off Audra Charles's advances with the kind of easy deflection that only made things worse. She confessed that despite everything, she wasn't ready to retreat. She still wanted to fight, to build something real, to prove that loyalty and ambition could coexist. Billy, ever the skeptic of good intentions, told her that he understood more than she knew. Earlier that day, he had stumbled upon Kane Ashby and Phyllis Summers in the park, a meeting so strange, so misplaced in the rhythm of his day, that it had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Kane's expression had been full of tension, and Phyllis's eyes burned with the kind of fire that meant trouble was brewing somewhere beneath the surface. Billy could sense that old rivalries were beginning to wake again, that the peace in Genoa City was nothing more than a fragile illusion hanging by a thread. Sally, trying to lighten the mood, teased him about his obsession with chaos. She said that she feared the man who couldn't let go of vengeance, who still found thrill in watching others unravel. But Billy, always walking the fine line between redemption and relapse, smirked and told her that revenge wasn't his goal anymore, though he couldn't deny the twisted satisfaction of seeing Kane lose his composure. Beneath the playful words, though, something softer was stirring in him. He admitted, in his own quiet way, that he wanted to change. He wanted to stop being the man who measured his worth by the destruction he left behind. Sally watched him with the wary admiration of someone who had once believed in second chances and had been burned too many times to say it aloud. When he raised his glass and proposed a toast to improvement, to the fragile hope that people could become better than their worst impulses, she smiled in spite of herself. The clinking of their glasses echoed through the bar like a promise neither was entirely ready to keep. Sally took a cautious sip and commented on the taste: ginger beer, light, harmless, almost innocent. Billy laughed, explaining that he had simply ordered what she was having, as if mimicking her restraint might save him from himself. When she asked if he had finally quit drinking, his answer came from a place deeper than pride. He told her that he was letting go of anything that kept him from becoming his best self. For a man like Billy Abbott, who had spent years oscillating between brilliance and ruin, the words carried the weight of both confession and defiance. Outside the bar, the night was not so forgiving. Across town, Nick Newman's patience was unraveling as he found himself once again drawn into the chaos of family and betrayal. His confrontation with Sienna had been building for days, a storm long delayed but impossible to avoid. The tension between them was not just personal, it was generational, a reflection of the Newman curse that demanded loyalty even at the cost of truth. Sienna's defiance was infuriating, her sharp tongue a weapon honed by survival, and when Noah entered the room, the air grew so thick with resentment that even silence became dangerous. Nick had always prided himself on control, but seeing the strain in his son's face, the quiet pain that Noah tried to hide behind forced calm, cut him deeper than he expected. Sienna's influence had changed Noah, hardened him, and for Nick, that was unforgivable. He saw in her not just a threat to his family but a mirror of every mistake he had ever made: reckless love, misplaced trust, pride disguised as protection. Their argument escalated until even Noah could no longer pretend neutrality. The Newman legacy had always been about power, but now it was tearing its own blood apart. In the aftermath, Sienna stood her ground, refusing to be silenced, while Nick walked away with the certainty that his family, no matter how strong, was cracking in ways that could not be repaired by wealth or control. Meanwhile, Sharon Newman had stepped into her own battle, one she had long avoided but could no longer ignore. Her confrontation with Mitch Bacall. The man the world once knew as Matt Clark was not a clash of enemies but a reckoning of ghosts. For years, Mitch had haunted her peripherally, a specter from another life who embodied every ounce of manipulation and psychological cruelty she had endured. Now he was back, alive, dangerous, and pretending that time had somehow cleansed him of his sins. But Sharon saw through him. The more he smiled, the more she recognized the darkness behind it. Her words were not spoken in rage but in conviction. She wasn't seeking revenge anymore, she was seeking liberation, not just for herself, but for every soul he had poisoned with his deceit. Mitch, always the master manipulator, tried to regain control, to make her doubt her memories, to reframe himself as the victim of circumstance. But Sharon had grown beyond his reach. Every scar he had left had turned into armor, every wound a reminder that survival was not weakness. Her determination shook him more than any accusation could. For the first time, Mitch found himself cornered not by evidence or law but by truth itself, the kind that no manipulation could erase. As the night deepened, the threads of these separate lives began to tangle invisibly, pulling the city toward another inevitable storm. Billy, unaware of the other dramas unfolding, lingered at the bar with Sally, their laughter softening the edges of their loneliness. There was a strange tenderness between them, a recognition that both were walking the same tightrope between redemption and ruin. For Sally, who had spent her life fighting to be seen beyond her mistakes, Billy's honesty was disarming. For Billy, who had always been drawn to complicated women, her resilience reminded him of the parts of himself he had nearly lost. Outside, the streets of Genoa City buzzed with whispers of power shifts, of old ghosts, of family wars reignited. At Newman Enterprises, Victor was silently calculating his next move, unaware that the fractures within his family were growing wider by the hour. At Jabot, Jack Abbott felt an unease he couldn't explain, a sense that the delicate peace between the families was once again slipping away. And somewhere between those towers of power, lives like Billy's, Sally's, and Sharon's unfolded quietly, carrying the emotional gravity that no fortune could protect against. Later, as the jazz club emptied, Billy sat alone for a moment, thinking about how many times he had promised to change and how many times he had failed. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the company, maybe it was the stillness, or maybe it was the rare feeling that someone actually believed him. Sally had left already, her perfume lingering like a memory, her laughter echoing faintly against the walls. He looked at his glass, the ginger beer now flat and warm, and smiled. Maybe redemption didn't have to come in grand gestures. Maybe it began in quiet choices, one night at a time. Somewhere across town, Sharon watched the lights of the city from her window, feeling the pulse of life moving forward even after all the battles she had fought. And in another part of Genoa City, Nick Newman stood under the cold light of his office, wondering when love had started to feel like war. The city itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with their unrest, holding its secrets close, waiting for morning to reveal the next chapter in its endless cycle of desire, guilt, and survival. Because in Genoa City, nothing ever ends cleanly. Every truth bleeds into another lie, every promise into another betrayal, and every redemption into another test. Billy might have found clarity tonight, but tomorrow, the ghosts would return. Sally might have smiled, but her heart still carried the weight of her own ambition. Nick might have turned away from Sienna, but the war between them was far from over. And Sharon, despite her triumph, would soon learn that confronting one ghost only invited others to emerge from the shadows. As dawn crept over the skyline, the city shimmered with false calm, a lull before the next wave of heartbreak. And in that fragile quiet, every heartbeat in Genoa City seemed to whisper the same truth. No matter how much they tried to change, no one ever truly escaped the past. The shadow room was filled with the kind of late-night quiet that only pretends to be peace. Beneath the low hum of music and the flicker of neon lights, tension clung to the air like smoke. Mitch Bacall stood behind the polished counter, his reflection fractured in the mirror behind him, and for a man who had built his reputation on deceit, the image staring back felt strangely foreign. He wore the calm of someone who had rehearsed his lies so often that even he had started to believe them. But across the room, Sharon Newman had never forgotten a face, and no disguise, no new name, no changed story could erase the darkness she saw before her. The moment she approached him, every ounce of the control he pretended to have began to crumble. Her fury was a thing of cold precision. It wasn't the rage of impulse but the rage of memory, sharpened by years of pain. She didn't care that they were in public, that the crowd around them sipped wine and laughed over jazz. To Sharon, the world had shrunk to this moment, to the man who had once stolen her peace and dared to show his face again. She called him what he truly was, naming him as Matt Clark, the monster she had buried long ago but never escaped. Every word struck like a whip, and the mask Mitch wore began to crack. He tried to deflect, to charm, to play the victim. But Sharon wasn't fooled. She told him that the only reason he still stood there unharmed was because they were in a room full of witnesses. It was the kind of threat that came not from hate, but from the raw instinct to protect everything he had once tried to destroy. Mitch smirked in his familiar way, that crooked smile that had always preceded something cruel. He tried to twist the narrative, to paint himself as misunderstood, a man maligned by gossip and half-truths. He even mentioned that Noah's father had punched him, making himself sound like the victim of misplaced vengeance. He said it as if it amused him, as if violence was proof of his innocence. Sharon could hear the falseness in every syllable. It was the same pattern, the same manipulation, the same chilling performance that had once trapped her in the web of his deceit. He told her he wasn't the man she thought he was, that he had changed, that the past belonged to ghosts. But Sharon knew better than to believe in redemption without remorse. The calmness in his voice was poison dressed as charm, and when he told her that he would bar both her and Nick from the shadow room, it was more than an insult, it was a warning. He was reminding her of the control he still believed he had, of the power he thought could keep her silent. But the days of Sharon's silence were long gone. She had clawed her way through madness, through grief, through every manipulation that men like him had ever used to keep her small. Now, standing in the glow of that sterile light, she no longer felt fear. She felt something purer, sharper, the kind of righteous anger that comes only when justice has been denied too long. She told him that he didn't know the meaning of pain yet, but he would. She would make him suffer before the end, and when she was done, there would be nothing left of him but the ruin of his own lies. She turned and walked away before he could respond, her heels striking against the marble floor like the countdown to his undoing. Back in her hotel room, the adrenaline drained, leaving behind the weight of years she thought she had buried. The city outside glittered in indifferent silence as she reached for her phone. The first message she left was for Phyllis. Her voice trembling, not from fear but from the unbearable pressure of holding too much truth. She told her everything she couldn't tell anyone else, everything that had come flooding back the moment she saw his face. Then she called Nick. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but she didn't cry. She couldn't afford to anymore. She told him she needed him to be careful, that the past had returned wearing a new name, and that she feared for what it might do to Noah. The message ended abruptly, as though saying more would make it real. When she hung up, she stared at the wall for a long time, realizing that closure had never been an option. Some wounds don't fade, they wait. Across town, at the hospital, Nick Newman's night was unraveling in its own way. He had barely slept since learning about the accident, and now, walking into Noah's hospital room, he felt that old mix of relief and fury that only a parent can understand. Sienna was there, too close, too familiar, pulling away from a kiss that made Nick's stomach twist with disbelief. The sterile light made everything too clear, the boundaries crossed, the secrets unspoken. Nick tried to hold his composure, but the sight of his son looking guilty and unguarded tore at him. He muttered a strained apology for the interruption, though there was no apology in his tone. Noah tried to explain, his words fumbling between surprise and defiance, but Nick wasn't interested in excuses. He wasn't just a father at that moment, he was a man watching his family unravel thread by thread. His attention shifted to Sienna, the woman who had somehow become both confidant and catalyst. He asked for a private word, and though she hesitated, she agreed, her expression unreadable. In the hallway, the tension thickened. Nick's questions came fast, fueled by a blend of protectiveness and distrust. He wanted to know what Sienna's intentions were, whether she truly cared for his son or was simply another opportunist drawn to the chaos that surrounded their family name. Sienna's replies were measured, her tone almost rehearsed. She insisted that whatever Nick thought he saw, it wasn't an affair, that Noah was an adult capable of his own choices. But Nick pressed harder, his voice sharp with the authority of a man who had seen too many lies dressed as love. He demanded to know the truth about the night of the accident, the night that had left Noah broken and Sharon terrified. Sienna said she had told him everything, that she had no idea who had wanted to hurt him. Nick's expression darkened when he asked about her husband. Did she really believe Mitch Bacall was innocent? Or was she still protecting him, the man he knew not as Mitch but as Matt Clark, the same man who had once terrorized his family, the same man responsible for crimes too cruel to forget? Sienna looked away, her silence speaking louder than any denial. And in that silence, Nick saw confirmation. He knew then that the past was repeating itself, that Mitch had never truly gone, that his poison had simply taken on new forms. Back at the shadow room, Mitch poured himself a drink he wouldn't touch. His reflection in the glass looked older, colder, and for the first time in years, uncertain. Sharon's fury had shaken something in him he didn't want to acknowledge, a crack in the facade he had spent decades maintaining. He could still feel the heat of her gaze, the venom in her words, the promise of retribution that lingered long after she was gone. For a man who had built his life on control, that loss of power was intolerable. He told himself that she couldn't touch him now, that he had money, influence, and the protection of a new identity. But deep down, he knew that Sharon wasn't bluffing. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. Every story he had crafted, every false narrative he had built for himself, was beginning to crumble. He thought about Sienna, the wife who believed his lies because believing them was easier than confronting the truth. He thought about Noah, the young man whose life he had nearly destroyed without even realizing how familiar the pattern had become. And for the first time, a flicker of something like fear crossed his mind. It wasn't fear of being caught, but fear of being known. Because in Sharon's eyes, he had seen himself for what he truly was, not misunderstood, not reformed, but irredeemable. The city seemed to hum with tension that night, every corner vibrating with the secrets of its inhabitants. Sharon sat alone in her room, staring at the phone, waiting for Nick to return her call. Nick stood in the hallway outside Noah's room, wondering when protecting his family had started to feel like fighting them. And Mitch, alone in the club he owned but no longer controlled, watched the shadows stretch across the walls like ghosts reclaiming their territory. The old battles of Genoa City were rising again, battles of truth and deception, love and vengeance, family and shame. The names had changed, but the story was the same. The past had returned, and this time, it wasn't going to fade quietly. By morning, the fallout had already begun. Sharon's voicemail to Phyllis had sparked concern, and soon, others would start asking questions. Nick's confrontation with Sienna would reach Noah's ears, reopening wounds that had never healed. And Mitch would find that no lie, no amount of charm, could undo the damage he had done. In Genoa City, redemption was always temporary, and every act of survival came at a price. The shadow room had been his sanctuary, his illusion of safety, but now it was just another stage where the truth was finally catching up. And somewhere, deep down, even he knew that Sharon Newman had just begun the war that would end him. Under the brittle neon calm of the hospital corridor, the fragile fabric of the Newman household began to fray in ways none of them had foreseen, as a private conversation spilled outward and exposed old wounds to the harsh light of the present. Sienna's eyes had slid toward Nick with a mixture of irritation and exhausted disbelief when he demanded to know why Mitch Bacall, the man she insisted was her husband, was not behind bars. She told him that the story she'd been fed about a disappearance decades ago was just that, a story stitched together from rumor and half-remembered files, a narrative meant to make sense of an impossible past. She insisted, with the defensive composure of someone protecting the life she had built, that her husband was not Matt Clark and that Nick was projecting ghosts where none existed. The words were calculated, meant to close the conversation and deflect the scrutiny that came with the Newman name. But Nick, who had long since learned to read the space between words, refused to let the matter drop. He saw the way Sienna's voice tightened, the way her jaw clenched when Noah's name was mentioned, and he sensed an urgency she would not willingly admit. In the narrow hallway, with the synthetic hum of the hospital lights pressing down on them, the accusation and denial hung like a charged wire between two people who both understood that lies had a way of metastasizing until they consumed everything around them. When Sienna left, her back a rigid line of resolve, Nick followed her absence immediately with an intrusion into the room where Noah lay recovering, pale and fragile from the recent trauma that had brought him under the hospital's fluorescent glare. Nick's questions were blunt, edged with the particular fear of a father who had seen his family shredded by deception before. He asked Noah why he had kept Sienna's closeness a secret, why he had not told his parents of the extent of his entanglement with her, and how much he actually knew about the man who had come into their lives under the name Mitch Bacall. Noah, bewildered and defensive, told his father the truth as he saw it, that he had always been drawn to Sienna in a way that felt genuine, that he had believed her trust in her husband was sincere, and that he had not realized the magnitude of the danger until it was almost too late. He admitted that he thought about her constantly but had not meant to hide things. He had been trying, in his own faulty way, to protect his mother and to reconcile his loyalty to his family with the strange tenderness he felt toward Sienna. Nick's voice hardened as he warned his son to stay away from both Sienna and her husband, fearful that their proximity would open more wounds and invite new betrayals. The admonition cut through Noah like a blow, and his retort, asking his parents to leave him alone and insisting he needed time to be alone with the chaos of his own feelings, was the first independent act of a man who realized he had been infantilized by others for too long. He wanted solitude, not to sulk but to think, to make sense of a life suddenly reframed by secrets. Sharon arrived then, abrupt and luminous with the raw need to understand, and the three of them stood in a fragile, tense constellation where every glance carried a history. Nick explained to her in terse, clipped phrases that the man who called himself Mitch Bacall was not what he appeared to be, that the alias masked a violent past and that he had personally known Matt Clark years ago as someone who had brought terrible harm to families. He told Sharon, with the weight of memory in his voice, that the man's badness was not rumor but fact, that he had seen cruelty before and recognized it again in the mannerisms, the manner of speech, the casual manipulations. The air in the hospital room thickened with accusation and disbelief, and Noah's plea to be left alone fell like a last leaf from a tree that had stood through storms. He insisted that his parents leave, not to be petulant, but to reclaim a small pocket of space where he could sort through the wreckage of his intimacy and his identity. He did not want to watch them fight about where he belonged or to have his loyalties become a battlefield for their moral certainties. The scene was an ugly, honest portrait of a family learning that the people they trusted and the stories they believed could unravel in a single, brutal night. Sienna, unsettled by the hospital confrontation and unable to rest in the face of a truth she had long suspected, returned to the shadow room with a simmering mixture of fear and resolve, stepping back into the venue that had become both refuge and stage for the lies that went through her life. She sought out her husband with the urgency of someone who had watched a hidden thing begin to glow and wanted answers before the light burned everything down. She did not ask politely, she demanded to know whether he intended to continue lying to her, whether he planned to keep weaving his falsehoods into the fabric of their marriage, or whether he would, at last, tell the truth and accept the consequences. The confrontation cut through the smoky air like a blade held to paper. Sienna's patience had limits, and she had reached them. Matt responded with deflection and denial, telling her he had endured a particularly unpleasant evening and that her accusations were ill-timed and unfair. His refusal to answer directly only hardened her resolve. She would not be placated by his evasions any longer, she needed evidence, proof that the man she'd married was the man he claimed to be. So Sienna pulled out her phone and showed him the photograph that had haunted her thoughts, a picture of a younger, harsher face with a familiar tilt of expression, taken in Genoa City 2 decades before, labeled in her mind as the image of Matt Clark. Her fingers trembled not out of fear for her safety alone, but because the act of accusing him would break the fragile shell that protected the life she had painstakingly assembled. She told him plainly that if he did not answer her now, she would go to the police. The ultimatum was not issued from spite, it was a desperate attempt to force a man who had controlled the narrative for years to disclose the shadowed center of his life. Matt's reaction was savage in its calmness. He threatened that involving the authorities would be a grave error, the sort of pronouncement that had less to do with the law than with the terrifying resources and ruthless resolve of a man who had learned to make fear a currency. He warned her that calling the police would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions, a claim meant to cow her into silence and to remind her of the stakes she had underestimated. What he wanted, more than anything, was to keep the secret intact, to preserve the fiction that had protected him and, until now, given him leverage over those around him. Sienna, however, was not so easily intimidated. She had survived illusions of safety before and knew that silence often meant complicity. The threat hung heavy between them, and for a moment the bar felt like a narrow boat adrift on a sea that could turn toward storm at any moment. Matt's insistence that the police would only make things worse was both a confession of moral bankruptcy and a strategic gambit. He counted on Sienna's instinct for preservation, her fear of upheaval, and the possibility that she would retreat rather than trigger an unknown avalanche. But Sienna, moved by the ordeal in the hospital and the presence of a son who had been caught between adult duplicity and childish need, felt a stubbornness rise in her. She had come to Genoa City believing she could build something honest, and the realization that her foundation might be rotten made her braver than she had been in a long time. Meanwhile, across the city, the ripples that this confrontation sent through the social waters of Genoa City began to intersect with the larger, more entrenched rivalries that had always defined it. Victor Newman and Jack Abbott, even if not yet directly involved in this particular flashpoint, would inevitably feel the aftershocks in their domes of power. The possibility that a man might be living under an assumed identity, wielding influence or access unknown to those around him, set the stage for a cascade of investigations, alliances, and strategic maneuvers. For Nick, the night had confirmed his worst suspicions. He would not allow his family to be preyed upon by a man with a history of manipulation. For Sharon, the confrontation was a vicious reminder that trauma could re-emerge in displaced forms, that the people who had once hurt them could reinvent themselves with new guises and continued malice. For Noah, the night forced a painful reckoning. The people he loved were fractured, and in their splits he had to find a self not entirely defined by their battles. Back in the shadow room, the standoff between Sienna and Mitch, between accusation and denial, between consequences and the will to avoid them, became emblematic of the larger moral crisis boiling through Genoa City. Matt's threats were not empty but carried the weight of a man who had navigated desperate waters with brutal efficiency, someone who knew how to weaponize fear, reputation, and silence. Sienna's decision to confront him publicly and to brandish evidence of his past was her attempt to wrest control back from a life that had been arranged for her by manipulation. She risked exposure, humiliation, and possibly danger, but she also opened the door to truth, and truth in Genoa, for all its ferocity, has a way of changing the rules of engagement. The choice to call the police or to stand silent would reverberate. A report could trigger a legal investigation that would pry open hidden files and reveal connections that some powerful figures would rather leave closed. Silence could allow a predator to continue his pattern unimpeded, and would condemn future victims to the same slow erosion of agency. Noah's cry to be left alone, to have his parents exit the messy center of his life, was less a selfish demand than a plea for space to reconstitute himself in the wake of adult conflicts that had co-opted his identity. He needed time to evaluate what loyalty meant in a world where the people he trusted could be false, where the scaffolding of his childhood might be rotten. The parents' silence at the door was not capitulation but a recognition that this moment belonged to their son to process. Each character, Sienna with her hard-won resolve and her phone's undeniable proof, Nick with his fierce paternal protectiveness and refusal to be surprised, Sharon with the terrible knowledge that history could return in a new face, stood at the cusp of decisions that would remake relationships and reputations across the city. And in the gray spaces between these confrontations, the practical calculus of survival unfolded. Phone records to comb through, old case files to exhume, witnesses to interview, and the ever-present danger that someone with the means and motive to silence inquiry might do so. Police involvement, which Sienna threatened and Matt warned against, would activate bureaucracies and attorneys, thrust into the limelight those who prefer their dealings in shadow. It would invite journalists, stir competitors, and force corporate titans to take sides. In Genoa City, where family names carry weight in history as currency, the personal becomes political and the political becomes deeply personal. The simple act of a woman showing a photo on her phone had the potential to fracture alliances, to mobilize defenders and enemies, and to turn private tragedies into public spectacle. By the time Sienna left the shadow room again, the night had hardened into a landscape of decisions. She walked away with the knowledge that she had moved the needle, that she had forced truth into the room and given Noah's father and mother reasons to prepare. She also knew that Matt's threat was not merely a bluff, it was a promise of the lengths to which he might go to protect his secret. The city, meanwhile, held its breath, a long, uneasy inhalation before the inevitable exhalation of consequence. The weeks to come would reveal whether law and community could contain a man who lived by manipulation, whether family bonds could survive revelation, and whether Noah, Sharon, and Nick could recover from the violence of discovery with their souls intact. In Genoa City, as always, the answer would be delivered in messy increments, in whispered alliances, in public denouncements, in courtroom drama, and in the patient, stubborn work of building trust anew. The photograph on Sienna's phone had become a catalyst, a match struck in dry tinder, and whether it would ignite a cleansing blaze or a ruinous fire depended on choices yet to be made.